There is a specific type of discomfort that almost no one can explain. It's not clear sadness nor obvious anxiety. It's that quiet feeling of being out of place even when, objectively, everything seems to be fine. You look around and think, nothing is wrong. So why do I feel this way? The work is okay, the people are polite and the conversation flows. But inside, something doesn't quite fit. It's like being physically present, but emotionally misaligned, as if there were an invisible distance between you and your surroundings. You participate, you respond, you smile, but you never truly relax. And the most confusing thing is this: you can't pinpoint a concrete cause. There was no conflict, no one rejected you, and nothing serious happened. Then you start to doubt yourself and wonder if you're being too demanding, too sensitive, or too difficult. Perhaps even ungrateful for not being able to feel comfortable in a situation that theoretically should be normal. But this discomfort doesn't come from nowhere. It's not a lack of maturity, nor a social failing, nor a hidden flaw in your personality. There is a real psychological explanation for this silent feeling of not belonging, and understanding this completely changes how you see yourself and how you interpret that unease that insists on appearing when everything seems fine. Imagine a common situation where you're in a work meeting and people are chatting, making quick comments, and laughing at predictable moments. You keep track of everything, understand the dynamics, know when it's socially appropriate to speak, and you speak. Nothing goes wrong, and yet his body remains slightly tense, as if he were always on standby. Now imagine a family gathering with repeated stories, familiar jokes, and that atmosphere that should convey familiarity. You listen, respond, and participate. But there's a subtle sense of displacement, as if you're observing the scene from the outside rather than being a part of it. In social contexts, this discomfort is usually discreet, doesn't draw attention, and doesn't explode. It manifests as tiredness that comes on too early, or a desire to leave without a clear reason. It manifests as a feeling of relief when the encounter ends, followed by guilt for feeling that relief. On the outside, you appear functional, but on the inside, there's a constant struggle to stay in shape. Many people describe it as not feeling like myself in those places, but they don't know exactly what that means. Others say they feel cold, distant, or disconnected, when in reality, they are just emotionally overwhelmed. The problem is that this type of experience rarely receives validation. When you try to explain, you hear responses like, "You're overthinking it," or "Everyone feels like that sometimes." And little by little, you begin to internalize the idea that the problem is you, that there is something wrong with the way you react, and that perhaps you are not suited for social environments, or that you have some invisible flaw that others don't have. But this discomfort is not a sign of social weakness, nor a lack of skills, and it is not an inability to connect. It's a legitimate response to emotional stimuli that not everyone notices, but you do. And recognizing this is the first step to stop blaming yourself for something that was never your choice. To understand why this feeling occurs, it's necessary to move beyond the simplistic idea of personality and look at how your nervous system processes the world. Different people not only think differently, they realize different. Some individuals have a higher level of emotional sensitivity, and this does not mean emotional fragility. This means that the brain processes more information at once, such as tone of voice, microexpressions, changes in mood in the environment, and unspoken tensions. This phenomenon is often described as keen perception. While other people filter out most of these stimuli automatically, you register them. The problem isn't perceiving too much, it's processing all of this in real time and without a break. In social settings, this often leads to what psychology calls social masking. You adjust your speech, your posture, your emotional reactions to remain functional and accepted, not consciously, but as a learned reflex. The brain understands that it is safer to adapt than to expose oneself. This constant effort comes at a cost. It consumes cognitive and emotional energy, and the result appears as emotional fatigue, a weariness that doesn't stem from what was said, but from what happened and monitored. From the nervous system's point of view, this is a form of adaptation, where your body learns to remain slightly activated and alert to possible changes in the environment. This is what we call adaptation of the nervous system. It's not necessarily clinical anxiety, but a subtle and continuous state of vigilance. Therefore, even when nothing is objectively wrong, your body cannot fully relax. He is too busy noticing, evaluating, and adjusting to everything and everyone around him. And here's the most important point. This doesn't happen because you're difficult, antisocial, or insecure. Your brain has learned to function this way in response to the world, and there is a clear psychological reason for this feeling of displacement. Understanding this logic completely changes the internal narrative of personal failure to neurological functioning. No emotional pattern forms in a vacuum. The way you navigate social life today often has roots in experiences so old that they seem too normal to be questioned. For many sensitive people, childhood was marked by some degree of emotional invalidation. Not necessarily explicit abuse or obvious trauma, but small, repeated signs that certain emotions were inconvenient, excessive, or difficult to handle. Perhaps you learned early on that feeling too much caused tension around you, so your brain did what brains always do. It adapted. You begin to observe before reacting, to read the environment before expressing yourself, and to adjust your presence so as not to cause discomfort to others. This process is what we later call mask, not as falsehood, but as relational survival strategy. You learned that being accepted required calibrating who you were, and that worked well enough to maintain connections. The problem is that this adaptation, while efficient in the past, becomes tiresome in the present. There is a profound difference between to be accepted and to truly belong. Acceptance happens when you are tolerated under certain conditions. Belonging happens when you don't need to reduce parts of yourself to exist in space. When belonging has never been completely secure, the nervous system doesn't shut down. It continues monitoring and adjusting. That's why, even in seemingly safe environments, something inside you remains alert. Not because the place is hostile, but because the body learned at some point that complete relaxation came at a cost. This current discomfort is not a sign that you have a problem. It is actually a sign of adaptive intelligence. Your brain did exactly what it needed to do to protect your connection with the world, but now, that same strategy is starting to take an emotional toll. Recognizing this origin changes everything, because what seemed like a defect comes to be understood as a learned response, and learned responses can be reviewed. When you spend years interpreting this discomfort as a personal failing, something becomes ingrained inside. The idea that there is something wrong with who you are. Reinterpreting this pattern requires a deeper change than simply thinking positive. It demands change the psychological lens which way you see yourself. What you call difficulty fitting in is often, in fact, profound perception. You notice nuances that other people ignore, pick up on subtle shifts in emotional climate, and perceive when something is said but something else is felt. This is not overthinking. It is refined emotional reading. This same sensitivity fosters genuine empathy, the ability to understand complex, even contradictory internal states. People like that tend to think in a more associative and less linear way. Thought is more complex because reality is perceived as complex. The problem arises when this psychological structure is placed in environments that demand constant superficiality, quick responses, and little emotional depth. In these contexts, the system comes into conflict with itself, not because it fails, but because it was not designed to function in those environments for extended periods. This explains why you might feel out of place in large groups, predictable conversations, or highly scripted social dynamics. And at the same time, to feel fully present in deep conversations, safe spaces, or relationships where you don't need to constantly translate yourself. People with this profile don't fit in easily because they weren't made to blend in. They need contexts where they can exist with fewer filters, less internal scrutiny, and less effort to appear adequate. When you stop trying to mold yourself to every environment and start recognizing which environments respect your way of functioning, something changes. The problem ceases to be who I am and becomes where and how am I trying to exist. This internal change is silent, yet powerful, and it gives back something essential: coherence between identity and experience. Over time, it becomes clear that this feeling of being out of place is not a sign of social failure. He usually shows up during times of psychological transition when the old way of adapting no longer works, but the new way is still taking shape. Discomfort arises when you begin to perceive the difference between functioning and belonging, and between adjusting to fit in and existing in a whole way. This phase is confusing because it doesn't offer immediate answers, and you don't know exactly what needs to change. You just feel that something needs to. And this feeling doesn't point to an internal error, but to an identity change in progress. Understanding this brings clarity, and you stop forcing yourself to feel comfortable where your body doesn't recognize it as safe. You stop interpreting social fatigue as laziness or disinterest and begin to hear discomfort as information, not as a flaw. Emotional autonomy arises when you understand how things work, not to isolate yourself from the world, but to choose more consciously where to invest your psychic energy. Not all space needs to be occupied, and not all dynamics require adaptation. Based on this understanding, something reorganizes itself internally. The nervous system stops fighting against itself. Identity becomes more stable because it doesn't depend on constant approval to sustain itself. Perhaps you weren't made to fit in easily, and perhaps your mind doesn't work at the same pace as the majority. When you understand this, the feeling changes, not because it disappears completely, but because it gains meaning. And when something makes sense, it stops controlling you. If this video helped you see yourself more clearly, please leave a like. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to receive more content like this. Until next time.